Hello and welcome to another episode of Interviews with Hyperpolyglots at HYPIA. I am the president, Dr. Usman Chohan, and today I have the pleasure of having one of our delightful new members with an exciting background, Enrique Lopez de la Peña. Welcome, Enrique.
Thank you. Very nice to be here.
So what's interesting in your case is that there is a diversity of languages and that there are interesting stories behind the reasons that you learned these languages. So I'd like you to quickly cover the languages you speak, and then we'll touch upon some of those stories.
Absolutely. So I guess that's a bit hard for me to answer because different people have very different definitions of what speaking a language actually entails. So the way I usually go about this is to say that I've studied, whatever number of languages, or that I've started to learn whatever number of languages in my life. So in that sense, what I can tell you is I've started to learn, or I speak to a certain extent, at least some 14, 15 different languages. Concretely, these are obviously, well, Spanish, my native language, English, in which I'm obviously fluent. I feel confident with my level in French, Italian, and Mandarin Chinese. I feel somewhat less confident, but I'm still fluent in Arabic, Japanese, Hebrew. By the way, Arabic includes modern standard Arabic as well as Palestinian dialect. Then Portuguese is a weird case because I understand pretty much everything, but if I actually have to speak or write, it's probably not that good. So I don't even know where to place it exactly. And then I obviously have some basic knowledge of other languages like Greek, Russian, tiny bit of Irish, tiny bit of Hindi, tiny bit of Korean, and a few phrases here and there in other languages like Icelandic or Hawaiian, but not much really.
That's fascinating. Now, with Chinese, which I consider to be a very, very difficult language that has a large international footprint, I struggled with it myself and then learned it. And I understand that you have a personal connection to this language. What is the personal connection?
Right. So as it turns out, my grandmother was the daughter of immigrants from Hong Kong. She was born and raised in Mexico, but this was obviously 100 years ago. And this wasn't even in Mexico City. Like they lived in a very small town in the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. So it's called Minatitlan, Veracruz. And if racism is so bad nowadays, I can only imagine what it must have been like 100 years ago and in such a small town. I don't know many details, but what I do know is that she went through some awful episodes of racism, and this caused huge trauma in her and her family. And so what she did basically as a defense mechanism, I would argue, and she actively forgot her language. She actively cast away her heritage, her culture, so that her daughters, basically, so my mom and my aunt, so that they wouldn't have to go through the same things that she did, which I understand 100%, but at the same time, I felt so sad and so angry when I first came to understand this, because I felt like a part of my family heritage and history had been stolen away from me. So I said, you know what, I have to do something to recover it, whatever it is. And I decided to learn Chinese, Mandarin in particular, because even though it's not really the dialect that my family would have spoken, it's what we have access to in Mexico. Probably in the US or Canada, you guys have more access to other variants of Chinese, but in Mexico, everything is pretty much centered around Mandarin. So I was like, okay, that works. At the end of the day, it's more useful. It's a bit easier perhaps, so we'll do that. So yeah, that's why.
And so your pursuit of it was more proactive than others would have undertaken. You have competed for it. You have actually studied in China at the university level. What is the story there?
Right. So basically, it all started with some classes that I was taking in my middle school with a Taiwanese teacher. Nobody took them seriously. It was a mess. They practically didn't count. I started to learn for real when a friend who's like me, like half and half, but she lives in China. She invited me to go, and that's when I went for the first time. I was there for like 3 weeks, and after those 3 weeks, with her help, obviously, I actually became somewhat conversational. I came back to Mexico. I started to study at the Confucius Institute. I progressed really quickly because I was really passionate about it. And then they invited me to a competition that many people know about, which is called the Chinese Bridge Competition. So this is organized by the Confucius Institute, happens in many countries of the world. And there are many Chinese bridges, but I was invited to the one for secondary school students. So we went to China, where we participated in this really cool reality show. And then there are awards for teams and for individuals. So the Mexican team in my year, I was 15 at the time, we won a scholarship to study wherever we wanted in China, basically for 1 semester. So I chose to go to Beijing Language and Culture University because that's where all of my friends were going to go as well. So yeah, I was there for 1 semester. And this was already like the 4th or the 5th time I went to China. I went there again with my university for like a seminar. And yeah, I've been to China many times. I love it.
Now, there is a social element to this as well, because branching out from Chinese and the people you met as part of that journey, the people you connected with did have an impact on you pursuing future languages as well. Isn't that right?
Exactly. I can notably think of my friends from Italy and from Russia. So in the case of the Italians, it was really fun because we already understood each other, even though we didn't necessarily speak each other's languages, just because Spanish and Italian are so similar. But obviously the fact of having friends there was a huge motivation for me to actually start learning the language seriously, which didn't really take a lot of effort because again, it's just very similar to Spanish. In the case of my Russian friends, it was very interesting because it wasn't really in my initial plans to learn Russian. I didn't find it, I don't know, particularly interesting or whatever. But then on one hand, yes, there was the fact that some of my best friends in the world, even nowadays, are Russian. And on the other hand, I met a lot of people in that contest who were not Russian, but from former Soviet Union countries. And I realized everybody could communicate in Russian still. Like it would have been obvious, perhaps, if I'd paid more attention to my classes in world history, I don't know. I just didn't realize that Russian was still so widely used in these countries, even nowadays,
Oh, yeah.
that it was such a global language. Then I was like, oh yeah, I mean, it's one of the official languages of the UN, makes sense. So I decided to go for it as well. In my opinion, actually, Russian is the absolute hardest.
There's some truth to that, especially after you proceed to an intermediate level in Russian and you have to do things like declension, which if you're an Indo-European language speaker of the Romance branch or even the Indic branch or the Indus River branch, it doesn't necessarily make sense that you would have to decline. So you would have to work so hard on your nouns in addition to your verbs. Isn't that right? Is that what you're referring to?
Yes, that is exactly what I'm referring to. The declensions and the verbal aspects as well. It's just a concept that doesn't exist in basically any other of the languages that I speak. So, I mean, I'm hopefully planning to retake Russian at some point in the future because I feel like these are just the things that come with practice, you know? Because if they're not part of the languages that you speak, they're just gonna have to come to you in another way.
Hmm. This is interesting because, well, there are some languages that you're exposed to that do have declension, but not at the level that the Slavic languages do. So, for example, if you're dabbling with Hindi, which is kind of a reactionary Sanskritized version of Urdu, there are two cases. So there's the normal and the oblique. And I know that foreign speakers of Urdu or of Hindi, they really struggle with just two cases because one is the normal where you're talking about a boy, and then there's the oblique where you'll be like, hey, boy, and the boy is slightly different in the singular and plural. And they struggle with that, but still people can infer from context. They'll say, oh, it's just a foreigner. It's okay, no big deal. You understand entirely. When you expose that out, expand it out to 6 cases in so many tenses, 4, 3 genders, that's really heavy stuff.
Right. And then I can only imagine what it's like in languages that I don't speak, like Polish, Czech, Slovak, let alone languages like Hungarian, Finnish, Basque, which have even more cases. Like, I don't know how people do it. It's amazing. One day, hopefully, we'll see.
Yes, but the challenge is always as we get older, these things become difficult. No native speaker, no child will ever conceive of any difficulty. And so, one thing that they have found is that if something is so hard as a language, it's probably because the only people who would have been native speakers would be children. And so, children can learn just about anything imaginable. And so, it's possible. But as you get exposed to other foreign cultures, well, you're probably going to stick to about 6 cases max, maybe 10 if you're really pushing it, if you have a lot of foreign interference or exchange or cultural connections, right?
For sure. But I think when you're motivated, I mean, everything's possible, right?
Well, I'd like to think so. A lot of people in HYPIA would like to think so. But as I get older, I find that there are limitations. It may just be internal motivation. It may be that there's some gears in the mind that are starting to become rusty because you get some set in your ways. And even if you have developed a training, I think that age does play some degree of some degree of obstacle is presented to you. But
Mm.
as that said, there are HYPIA members who are well past 50. I'm thinking of like 5 or 6 people who are over the age of 50 who do continue
Mhm.
to learn things either because of practitioner requirements or because of an interest. So there are two arguments about it.
No, for sure. I mean, I actually took linguistics myself when I was studying away in New York. So I definitely know everything about the critical period and all of the theories behind, language acquisition. So I mean, there's no way to deny that. But at the same time, I think people tend to be really harsh on themselves. Like a lot of people seem to have the idea that if I don't speak a language as a native speaker, then I suck, basically, which I think couldn't be further from the truth. Some people might have that goal and it's respectable, but for me personally, it's always about, well, am I able to use this language to communicate? I might not be able to speak it perfectly. I might have a foreign accent or whatever, but am I reaching the goal that I want? Am I able to connect to people from the regions where the language is spoken natively? So for me, that's I think the main point in learning the language. And yeah, I guess I don't have such high standards, so it's cool.
No, but I think that's a very mature and grounded way to approach it. If you set yourself up for perfection, you're setting yourself up for failure. Because even native speakers, if you think critically enough about the issue, native speakers really mess up their own languages. Part of it is
For sure.
collective drift, semantic drift, whatever, but part of it is also that people just don't pay attention. Here, I'm currently residing in Pakistan, and it's frightening how much. How often people make mistakes of declension, how often
Mhm.
people make errors of gender just because they're speaking so casually that they haven't thought through the entire sentence. And so they'll have to end up putting a masculine and for what was a feminine subject. But by the time they get to the end, they're like, whatever, just let it through.
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a real issue, but
And your passion has been to get involved with the United Nations. What's the story there?
well, it's more of a dream nowadays than a reality, uh, because from what I know, most of the actual positions that are available at the UN are for people who already have master's degrees. So it's obviously what I'm planning to do next. Uh, what I love about the UN is that it's so broad and its outreach is just unlike any other. And what I want to do in life is basically help people, not just in my own country, but the people who are in greatest need in a multiplicity of issues. And so I believe that the UN is basically probably not the only place, but the best place, I would say, to do that when you're interested in such a large number of issues. What I can tell you though is I have had a passion for the UN since I can remember. It was a long process. I'm probably not going to go into it because it would take a lot of time. But basically, everything started with a world flag sticker album that my mom gave to me when I was 5 years old. And so I started with this very romantic view of the world and wanting to visit every country, learning a lot about countries, watching travel shows, hearing about well, he passed away when I was 3, but hearing about my grandfather's stories through my mom, because my grandfather traveled a lot, uh, looking through his collections of banknotes, coins, postal cards, stamps. So yeah, So that's how it started. And then in middle school, I joined the MUN club, which is obviously where my romantic view became a lot more realistic. And I learned about all the conflicts that were hiding, I guess, underneath those, all the flags and the maps that I once romanticized. I feel like I'm practically quoting my master's degree application essays, but it's true. I mean, it's for a reason. And then the other thing, well, I mean, my trajectory at MUN was pretty long. I went to like 20 conferences in different languages, of course, which was really helpful. And I also went to, well, I was selected as a winner of a contest organized by the UN 4 years ago. So this was an essay writing contest precisely about the importance of languages to unite people. It's called Many Languages, One World. The contest, I think, has been canceled due to budgeting reasons, but it was a great thing. I met some of my best friends there. It was a really cool experience. It was also cool because the essay couldn't be written in your native language or in the language of your studies. So it couldn't be Spanish nor English for me. I did it in Chinese for obvious reasons, and I was selected. So that was really cool.
That's fantastic. The
Mhm.
UN has a complex history, grand motives, and then the practicalities of running a multipolar world or even a unipolar world recently has been very challenging for an idea such as the United Nations. I did go back to read the writings of people who helped to found the UN, the idealists. They're basically people between your age and my age who were seeing the trauma of a world war, and they really, really wanted a fresh start for the world. So that fresh start spirit was deeply entrenched in the founding myths of the United Nations, and they're very powerful. They're very inspiring. And if we just start today with those same ideals, suddenly you feel so refreshed, like it's as valid in 2020 as it was in 1945. But over time, depending on which country you're from or what conflicts you've seen, yes, that same journey of starting with the cute atlas, which I had too, by the way, with the world capitals, with the cute flags and all, it's very exciting. But over time, I had a similar journey to what you've undergone, that you start to see it's very nasty. The world conflicts, the UN has stood aside while they've happened. It's very heartbreaking. So here in Pakistan, for example, a lot of people do want the UN to step up its game, but they do remember that the oldest issue pending in the United Nations is the Kashmir issue, which still has to be resolved. And this is the sort of issue that is a kind of a mass trauma for the biggest region in the world. But when you discuss it with people who are outside the region, they kind of shrug, like, I don't know much about that. Sorry, it's not of interest. And so it is heartbreaking to see that there is so much to be done. And the United Nations has gone through some effort, but that effort is stymied without the collective will of everyone. So how do you confront those sorts of problems of reality and reconcile them with the ideals? That's a big challenge.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, I think a lot of people criticize the UN because they focus on its failures, which is obviously a very valid view, like standpoint, because it has failed multiple times. It failed in Israel, Palestine. It failed in Rwanda. It failed in Bosnia. Um, but at the same time, if there's one very interesting thing that I learned during my college career was the whole concept of counterfactuals.
Mm,
So basically, what people often don't think about is how would the world be in the absence of the UN? And I do think it would be much worse. Obviously, it's harder to see the achievements because it's just so much easier to focus on the negatives. But I would be more positive and encourage people to also look into the places where the UN has done wonderful, like a wonderful job. Um, at
very
the
good
same
point.
time, I'm not naive. I do realize that the UN has lots of room for improvement, which is part of why we want to work there as well. I think it's tough because, like, after a course that I took about the UN in college, I realized one of the main issues is a lot of governments honestly don't take it seriously. So it's just depressingly underfunded. It's not very realistic to expect it to achieve all of its potential when it's not taken as seriously as it should. So there's a lot, but yeah, I mean, I guess like focusing on the counterfactuals really helped me. It serves as a driving force to a certain extent. And I can say the same thing about my job. Like it can be frustrating. I'm currently a researcher, by the way, and a consultant at an international organization for LGBT rights. So it's something that I love. At the same time, it feels frustrating that everybody, like my colleagues and I, we work so hard, such a small team doing so many amazing things. And then the panorama that we are seeing in many parts of the world is just so bleak. It feels like we're working for nothing. But again, I think it's about, even though it's not easy, I guess maintaining the balance between the positives and the negatives.
Absolutely. And you do see countervailing forces. So let's say if we take the topic of LGBT rights, for example, you are seeing progress in many parts of the world. At the same time, you're seeing reactionary elements. So where you thought that the case was settled and then progress had been made, they're actually going two steps back. So one step forward, two steps back. And so overall, when you're trying to create a picture of where the world is and where the world might be in accordance with your values, you cannot have a static image. And that's very challenging because you cannot see a linear path forward. For every one step you take forward, you might have two steps back. Do you agree?
Exactly, for sure.
And what are some of the other interests that take a lot of your time? I mean, you're a guy who is very busy, a guy that is taking on many challenges given your age. So what are some of the other things that interest you?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I've kind of alluded to this, but um, basically anything focused on helping people. Um, so I'm interested in things like climate change, forced displacement, financial inequality, social injustice in general, discrimination. But I would say if I had to pick my two main interests, they would be on one hand, LGBT rights, because it's something that affects me on a very personal level. And then on the other hand, international conflict prevention and resolution. So I love the fact that you brought up Kashmir because it's a really fascinating issue to study, despite how depressing it is
Mhm.
and how incendiary the topic can be. Um, and so on that note, I think it also relates to why I decided to learn certain languages, in particular Arabic and Hebrew. So I actually studied in the UAE. And one of the reasons why I chose to go there, despite the fact, well, the well-known fact that it's not the best place to exist as an LGBT person, is the
Okay.
fact that there's a lot of things that happen in the Gulf region that you can only truly understand if you're there from the inside. Also, you know, the Arab world in general is portrayed in the media as a very politically contentious, unstable region. Like the media is basically not kind to the Arab world and the Muslim world in general. Um, there's a lot of stereotypes, lots of ignorance. So I wanted to go for myself and see what was true, what wasn't. I was afraid at first, but I channeled my fear and transformed it into energy to learn Arabic. Why? Because I usually find that languages are the best way for me to connect to other cultures, at least definitely the best way to start doing so. And yeah, no, it was an amazing journey. I made lots of friends, met lots of new people. Uh, I realized that a very strong issue for those from the region was the Israel-Palestine conflict. So that took a lot of my time and energy, just doing a lot of research on that, um, trying to really understand every single possible viewpoint about it. So actually my semester abroad during college, my first one at least, was at NYU Tel Aviv, which was really fascinating because I was constantly moving between Israel and Palestine. It was amazing for the language part also. I got to practice my Arabic and my Hebrew, obviously. Um, and I do think that without my languages, I would not have been able to travel as freely, first of all, and to connect to people as much. Because the way people interact with you when you talk to them in their native language is just very different than if you talk to them in a language that feels foreign to them or in a language that they don't really understand very well. So, so yeah, I mean, all the more reason to learn languages, right? For me, it's all about connecting with people.
So climate change, LGBT rights, international conflict resolution. You seem to be a very right-wing guy.
Right wing?
Just joking.
Oh, that was sarcasm.
It's entirely sarcasm. All of these causes are big for left-wing people. Young people are articulating and these values, and they're facing enormous challenges in trying to drive change. The climate change issue, for example, is treated as a wicked problem, one that is not entirely resolvable without having all the stakeholders, etc., etc. And so, why do I bring this up with the sarcasm that you seem like a very right-wing guy to me? Is that there are tendencies that I want to investigate in the political and social worldviews constructed by members of HYPIA, which is to say people who are hyperpolyglots and have engaged with world culture so intensely and keep such an open mind about it. There is a paper to be written about the political and social inclinations of hyperpolyglots, the hypothesis being that they're probably some of the most open-minded people you'd find. Would you agree?
That's a very interesting question, actually, because earlier today I was blocked on Facebook by a person who speaks a lot of languages because this person is a very strong ideology. He's a communist, basically, from Greece, and he strongly disagreed with my idea of more measures for birth control around the world, something to, I guess, mitigate the effects of overpopulation in the environment. I guess it came off the wrong way, and he was just so angry. He blocked me. He was, I guess, if you want to classify this guy somewhere in the political spectrum, he would have been like the far left. But I don't think open-mindedness is necessarily correlated to political orientation. I'm biased because obviously, yes, I'm a very liberal and left-wing person myself. But I do think people have a hard time listening in general, especially with the lockdown and everything that's happening in the world nowadays. I do see a certain left-wing tendency among people who speak a lot of languages, precisely because of the hypothesis that you're mentioning. At the same time, I definitely don't think it's a perfect correlation, because I can for sure think of examples of people who are hyperpolyglots, but then they seem to stand up for causes that are definitely not compatible with ideals of social justice. So I guess there's all kinds. Basically, there is a correlation, but like most correlations, it's not a perfect one.
That seems to make perfect sense. There are limitations to it. When you say that, you make me reflect, and it's probably true that there is, it's certainly not a one-for-one. But the world as it's going, we're speaking in a context of a pandemic, increased conflicts, increased tensions over territory, but also fears of the territory itself and climate change. So what is your prognosis for the world over the next 10 years?
I'm a bit pessimistic, unfortunately, because I do see a lot of right-wing governments becoming extremely popular. And we know for a fact that the vast majority of these governments are not the kindest to minority groups, to vulnerable groups in general, to those who would be potentially most affected by crises like climate change, which is one among many others. I work a lot with what has to do with hate speech myself, and the rate at which people are normalizing hate speech these days is heartbreaking. It's terrifying, honestly. So yeah, my prognosis is probably not super optimistic, but that doesn't mean that I'm not hopeful that, you know, people doing small changes in many parts of the world can make a difference, because I've seen this happen. I think I'm allowed to talk about this. I don't think there are any confidentiality issues, so I'll give one example. Basically, the organization where I work, which is ILGA World, which, as many people may know, is a true icon in terms of LGBT rights advocacy in the international politics arena. So one of the things we did, for example, last year was reporting that Gabon had criminalized consensual same-sex sexual activity, which is a fact that had flown under the radar of basically everybody, even activists within Africa. Fortunately, we were able to locate this news. We were able to report it in the yearly report that we produce, and partly because of the momentum and the international reaction caused by our reporting of that fact, Gabon reversed this discriminatory law less than a year later. So when you see these changes happening, you do become a bit more hopeful, I guess, despite the overall gloomy panorama, which again goes back to my active effort to focus on the positives more than the negatives, you know, to offset that naturally, I guess, pessimistic bias that human beings tend to have.
I understand. I think this is a very noble approach to the set of complex problems that we confront. Here's another hypothesis, that it's because of the boomers. And what I mean by that is that there is a static, entrenched generation. That cohort is exerting its last hurrah. That is why, for example, in the American election, you have a guy who is 76, Biden, a guy who is, sorry, Bernie Sanders is 76, Biden is 75, Trump is 72. These are extremely old people. And so this may be the last hurrah of this one generation, and then it's over. And then it is up to Gen X, backed up by Gen Y, to rebuild the world. What do you think about this intergenerational perspective?
I mean, I definitely think there's part of truth to it, because ideals and values and morals do change over time, undeniably. At the same time, again, I don't think that correlation is indicative of any causality, and I don't think it's a perfect correlation, because there are many so-called elderly politicians who are very progressive in what they stand for. And there are young people who are extremely conservative, on the other hand. So I don't think age is the only factor that can truly explain the complexity of like the political situation worldwide nowadays, much in spite of the fact that it is something influential to a certain extent, which makes sense if we think of it, because ideally to rule a country, you need someone who has a lot of experience and lots of knowledge, right? Some of that knowledge only comes with age. Of course, it becomes a problem when, in addition to that knowledge, you have values that are not compatible with what people perceive as social justice nowadays, which is the issue for me, at least, when I think of politicians like Donald Trump or Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil. Even my president, honestly, to a certain extent, I think it's been a huge disappointment in many ways, because he promised to set Mexico free of many of the systematic problems that we've been dealing with for nearly a century or more. And then he turned out to be extremely conservative in lots of his policies, notably the ones regarding the environment, for example. Like, he is betting on fossil fuels, whereas we as a country have the potential to do so many different things, and so much better than that. To name just one example, because he's also like partnered up with far-right parties. Like, this is a strategy. I guess he did this to assure more votes during the election, but still, you know, it's a matter of integrity. I don't know. It has been disappointing. We have been struggling a lot these days, again, especially more so with the lockdown and with the poor management of the crisis in Mexico. So it's a tough time. But again, I don't think, I'm sorry, I feel like I'm digressing a lot, but yeah, I don't think all of this can be explained just because the man in power is so-called elderly, or, you know, a boomer or whatever.
No, I see your point, and there are tendencies among cohorts of young people also that are worrying. If you think about it, these boomers back in their heyday, these guys were the hippies, these guys were the flower power, the anti-war movements, and the monsters that they have become over time suggest that when we get older, we might be just as monstrous. And so that is a very, very frightening verdict on the human condition. So as a small community, hyperpolyglots promote and certainly at HYPIA, they promote values such as tolerance, open-mindedness, compassion, and a discovery of other cultures. Do you think that more people will resonate with this going forward, or it'll start to become more and more of a fringe thing as you see countervailing forces push these things aside?
I think yet again, this is an issue that is going to be polarizing. Because on one hand, if you have people who are already interested in foreign cultures and foreign languages and heritage, obviously there is a trend, and it's a clear trend to come in contact with other countries, other forms of living, other customs. At the same time, because of globalization, there are certain languages, the so-called lingua francas of the world, notably English, that are basically eating up the rest.
Mm-hmm.
So there's also, on the other hand, a very widespread attitude of people saying, well, I already speak a global language. Why on earth would I bother learning something else? Like, what's the use? What's the point? So I do see definitely both of these things happening at the same time. I think our role as hyperpolyglots is to hopefully raise awareness on the beauty and the unique advantages that learning multiple languages can have, which is something difficult to understand, I guess, if you haven't really been through that process. But no, for sure, I do see some hope in that sense as well. Again, I think there's all kinds of people, even within our community. I'm not going to say names, but I have this friend, for example, who's the kind of guy who, even if you've never met him before, is going to be like, hi, my name is so-and-so. And by the way, I speak 21 languages, which in my opinion, it's a bit obnoxious, you know, like, okay, great, you've worked very hard and it's a huge achievement and it's something to be very proud of, but do you really want it to be like your presentation card, you know, because it might come off the wrong way. And I see like people in the group chat, for example, talking to each other in languages that are not their native languages at all, or the native languages of anyone. To me, that's a little bit weird, honestly, just because, again, for me, languages are more about connecting to people from certain regions more than they are about, I hope it doesn't sound mean, but like more than they are about showing off, you know, like, oh, I am this person and I speak 50, 100 languages, you know? So,
Yes.
yeah, there's a
No,
lot going on.
I think you've brought up a beautiful point. I have a tendency to bring this up off and on in interviews because it really, I do find it obnoxious, but it is something that just about all members of HYPIA have encountered at some point. And HYPIA is an organization that deliberately opposes the showmanship element on YouTube and other places where, exactly as you just pointed out, you're naming a friend, but there's just anonymous faces where they come and they're like, hi, I speak 20 languages. Here they go, pa, pa, pa. And they just list them out and they do a bit of a circus performance. And then when you actually dig into their fluency or proficiency, it isn't there. It is just something that they think they can monetize. So they're trying to convert it into capital, to deal in a capitalist society, to gain links and views and so on. There's economic flaws in that. First of all, there's no barriers to entry. I mean, if any one of us at HYPIA could just demolish that sort of thing just by learning more languages if it was a competitive enterprise, but it isn't. And there are no barriers to entry. But then again, in terms of the instrumentality, you're trying to show off that you speak all these things. It is toxic to the values underlying, for example, HYPIA, which is to say that it's not about you or me, it's about us. Language is about N+1 people, meaning that you have it and then you share it with someone else. That's the purpose. And to try to monopolize it artificially is a farce. And so HYPIA is about the community. So there is no actual leader of HYPIA, and all sorts of cool things are being done by members in whatever region to do whatever thing. And that's how it should be, decentralized. And I discussed this with other HYPIA members, that these are anarchist principles. There is no centralization. There is no headquarters. It is people that work towards respect and mutual aid. And those are the values that don't get us promoted. So you won't become a rock star becoming part of HYPIA, but you will be part of that community that you perceive as the utopia, where people do pursue language and pursue these other linguistic and cultural elements of other societies to create a better world in silence, only communicating as part of connecting with others, but studying quietly to develop themselves in a better world.
For sure. I mean, that should be everyone's ideal, regardless of the discipline. Could be languages, could be science, could be art, the arts, could be whatever. I think humility is a very important trait that we often forget about, especially if we are, I guess you could say, talented or in some areas, or can learn certain things with more ease than other people. It's easy to lose sight of where you come from and how other people might perceive you, and especially, yeah, the image or the imprints that you want to leave in other people's minds, right? For me, I think it's also hard to empathize with like those kinds of attitudes, because I also see, well, I've also come across many people in my life who don't know me very well and who basically only know me as, oh yeah, that guy who speaks many languages, which is great because yes, it's something that I'm proud of. It's something that I've worked very hard for, but that makes it hard to see everything else that I am, you know, everything else that I've achieved in the social
Precisely.
sciences mainly, but you know, in general.
That
So
is
we're a lot more than just hyperpolyglots.
absolutely, and that is the purpose of these interviews we are doing, to show the multidimensionality. This is above all the thesis of these interviews we are doing, to show that you are not a walking dictionary or a walking Google Translate. There are other elements to your life that help to subsume the entirety of who you are, which is much more than just the instrumentality of languages. On that happy note, I would like to thank you, Enrique, for this wonderful discussion. It did discuss things that are emotionally charged for us because we do hold strong beliefs and we do want to make this a better world. This is something that you and I and all the members of HYPIA share, that there is something better to be done. So thank you.
Thank you, on the contrary, for having me here. I think it's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm happy to be part of such a wonderful community.
Thank you. Take care.